So in this lecture, we're going to talk about photosynthesis. And we're going to start off by talking about how organisms obtain food. And so one of the things that we talked about in the last lecture is how plants and animals are mutually dependent on one another. And our last lecture, we spent talking about how animals and also plants do cellular respiration. And in cellular respiration, so the arrow's going this way. So cellular respiration. And in cellular respiration, we take glucose and oxygen. And remember that when we break the bonds in glucose, we release the energy stored in that bond, and that energy is used to produce ATP. And a byproduct of cellular respiration is going to be carbon dioxide and water. And so plants, carbon dioxide in the water that we give off, and they can do photosynthesis. And what they do is they take that carbon dioxide in that water and they fix that carbon dioxide into glucose. And so they use sun energy to build up sugar. You require energy. And so the energy that plants use to do photosynthesis comes from sunlight. And so notice that this ends up with a constant cycle. Photosynthesis, and they'll take the carbon dioxide and water and convert it into glucose and oxygen. And then us as animals, we take the glucose and oxygen, we do cellular respiration, and as a byproduct, we make carbon dioxide and water. And then plants do photosynthesis, and the cycle continues over and over again. Now, plants we call producers because they're able to produce their own food. Organisms that cannot produce their own food are referred to as consumers. And there are several levels when we talk about consumers. A primary consumer is going to be an organism that eats a producer. So basically, it's an animal that eats plants. A secondary consumer is one that's going to eat a primary consumer. And so this is going to be a carnivore. When plants and animals die, they then get decomposed by decomposers such as bacteria, fungi, and that then can be recycled. And so plants are going to use light energy to make organic compounds, so to make chemical energy to be used by themselves and also by consumers. So what do we call an organism that can make their own food? Well, we call those autotrophs. Troph meaning feeder, auto meaning self. And so when we talk about autotrophs, there are several types. There's what's called a chemoautotroph, which is basically an organism that obtains energy from chemicals, right? Chemiautotrophs, they obtain energy from chemicals like sulfur or ammonia. Photoautotrophs, photo refers to light, those are able to obtain energy in the form of light. This is not limited to just plants. Remember that we talked about that prokaryotes, such as cyanobacteria, can also do photosynthesis. And they are also able to take carbon dioxide and water and convert it into glucose and oxygen. And remember that that's where a large proportion of the oxygen in the atmosphere actually comes from, is not just only plants, but other organisms as well. In terms of eukaryotes, again, we always think of plants, but again, that's not the only organism. Diatoms, dinoflagellates, algae, these are all examples of organisms that can obtain carbon dioxide and water and convert it into chemical energy. And so how do plants get the things that they need? Well, on the bottom side of the leaves are these tiny little pores called stomata. And when the stomata are open, it allows carbon dioxide to go in. When you think about water, when we water a plant, what part of the plant do we water? And the answer is that we water the soil. And that's because the roots have a very large surface area, which helps with water absorption. And we talked about how one of the ways that water gets from the roots up to the leaves is through what was called transpiration. And that is that when those pores are open, some water will come out and all the water attached to it, because remember, water is cohesive. When water molecules stick together and some water evaporates, all the water molecules that are attached will move up the plant with it. So autotrophs feed themselves, right? They're self-feeders, but they also feed all other heterotrophs as well. And so life on Earth is solar powered, right? Without the plants, life would cease to exist. So organisms rely on organic compounds for energy. Autotrophs, or producers, make those organic compounds. Heterotrophs, hetero means other, troph is feeder, so other feeders like consumers obtain organic compounds from other organisms. And so if we look at this food diagram, here we have our producer, and this producer would also be known as our autotroph. And this snail here that would eat the plant, we would call this a primary consumer. Remember that the primary consumer is the one that eats the plants, and these would be referred to as herbivores, plant-eating animals. Over here, this would be called a secondary consumer, and a secondary consumer eats a primary consumer. This level here, this would be a tertiary consumer, and tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers. And so these two groups are carnivores. They eat other animals. And then when these organisms die off, then we have decomposers, which are going to break them down. And detrivores are a type of decomposer that feed on dead, cast-off materials that most other organisms don't want to consume. An omnivore is an organism that eats both plants and meat. So as long as you're not a vegetarian, you would be considered an omnivore. So we're going to start and talk about photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is a process by which certain groups of organisms capture energy from sunlight and converts that solar energy into chemical energy that's initially stored as a carbohydrate. And so if you think about photosynthesis, remember that photosynthesis is like the reverse of cellular respiration, right? Cellular respiration took glucose and oxygen, and it broke down the glucose into the carbon dioxide and the water. And notice photosynthesis is the same, except the reaction goes in the other direction. In this case, we're taking carbon dioxide and water. And again, remember, anytime building something up, you have to invest energy. And that energy comes from sunlight. And so plants use light energy, and they are able to produce glucose and also oxygen gas that, again, we use to breathe. So how does the plant get the things that it needs? And again, photosynthesis is going to take place in the leaves, right? And so one of the reasons that leaves tend to be broad and very flat is to try and maximize light absorption. When you guys go on your Oak Canyon nature walk, you'll get to see that under different conditions, plants that live, for example, in environments that are very hot and very dry, it's not going to be an advantage to have big, broad leaves. Instead, in those areas, the leaves are going to be really small. And the reason is because on the leaves, on the bottom side, are these stomata. And again, these stomata are pores, and when they're open, carbon dioxide is able to get in because the plant needs the carbon dioxide in order to make the sugar. And so carbon dioxide gets in, but what's going to leave is going to be the oxygen gas that they produce in photosynthesis, as well as water. And again, that's because the water, when the water leaves out of these pores, it has cohesion and water molecules stick together, and that helps pull the water from the roots up to the leaves where it's needed for photosynthesis. So again, in places that are very hot and very dry, you wouldn't want to have big broad leaves that have a lot of surface area, because then those plants would lose too much water. And so that's going to be one of the fun things when you guys go on your hike. You'll get to see the different adaptations that different plants have that allow them to survive in very specific conditions. The way that water gets into the plants, again, is through the roots, and the roots have little tiny hairs which help increase surface area to help maximize water absorption. And then in plants that have a vascular system, the water is going to move from the roots up to the leaves through these veins or in these vascular tissues. Now, where exactly does photosynthesis take place? So if we look at the leaf, here's a cross section of a leaf. Out here we have epidermis. You also have epidermis. Your skin is your epidermis. And your epidermis is used to protect you against foreign invaders and also to keep water in. And so plants also have an epidermis for very similar reasons. In the middle, this layer in the middle is referred to as the mesophyll layer. Meso, like middle. Okay, so mesophyll layer is in the middle. And in those mesophyll cells, those are the ones that are going to have the chloroplasts. And remember from our lecture about organelles, the chloroplast is going to be the site of photosynthesis. And so this is going to happen, this is going to take place within those mesophyll cells. Now, as a little reminder about the structure of the chloroplast, remember that a chloroplast has a smooth outer membrane, a smooth inner membrane, and it has a third membranous system inside that are called the thylakoid membranes. And so these are going to be your thylakoid membranes, and these stacks of thylakoid membranes are what we refer to as granum. And they look kind of like stacks of poker chips. Because of this three membrane system, we end up with three compartments within the chloroplast. In between the outer and the inner membrane is referred to as the intermembrane space, just like for the mitochondria. Remember that the mitochondria, the space between the outer and the inner, is also called the intermembrane space. The space in the chloroplast inside the inner membrane is not called the matrix like it is in the mitochondria. The space inside the inner membrane is referred to as the stroma. The space inside the thylakoid membranes, that's going to be referred to as the thylakoid space. And so this is going to be important to recall these parts of the chloroplast in order to understand where photosynthesis takes place. And the first step in photosynthesis is going to occur in these thylakoid membranes. And these thylakoid membranes have these pigments in them, and these pigments help to absorb certain wavelengths of light. So how does sunlight drive photosynthesis? Well, sunlight contains energy called electromagnetic energy or radiation. And when you look at the different types of electromagnetic energy, visible light is only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. Electromagnetic energy travels in waves. And if you look over here, if we look at our visible light, you can remember it as Roy G. Biv. So the way I remember Roy G. Biv. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Red, these are going to be the longest wavelengths, meaning that those are going to have large distances between the peaks. So in this case, you're going to have a big distance. Whereas over here for the violet, those wavelengths are going to be very, very small because the distance between the two peaks is very small. And so again, the wavelength is going to be the distance between these two peaks. Red light has these longer wavelengths, and the longer the wavelength, the lower the energy. And so red and orange wavelengths of light are relatively lower in energy compared to violet and indigo, which have shorter wavelengths but higher energy. And so the relationship between wavelengths and energy is inversely related, right? So the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. Now, embedded in those thylakoid membranes and these pigments are going to certain wavelengths of light. And so these pigments that are embedded in these membranes will absorb very specific wavelengths of light. And the reason that plants appear green to your eye is that the plants are absorbing the other wavelengths of light, but not the green. The green is what's being reflected or transmitted, and so that's what our eyes see, because the green light is what's being reflected. It's not being absorbed by the plant. And so this diagram over here is showing you these absorption spectrums for different pigments. And so what you're looking at are these are the different wavelengths of light. Again, remember that red has the largest wavelengths, Violet has the lowest. And if you look, these different color lines correspond to different pigment molecules. Chlorophyll A over here, notice that this is the absorption of the light. And so notice chlorophyll A absorbs primarily violet, indigo, and maybe a little bit of blue light. As well as over here, notice it absorbs some of the orange and some of the red wavelengths. If we look at chlorophyll B, notice chlorophyll B absorbs some of the violet, indigo, blue, and then again, over here, it's going to absorb some of the yellow and some of the orange. The carotenoids, which are accessory pigments, notice those are going to absorb purple, blue, and some green, but reflect the warm colors of light. And so notice that none of these pigments absorb a lot of light in the green to green yellow wavelengths. And so this is why plants appear green, is because they do not absorb those wavelengths of light. Instead, those wavelengths of light are reflected or transmitted, and this is why plants appear green. So this is a critical thinking question for you. I want you to think about, why do you think leaves change color in the fall? Right? So if you think of places, like if you were to go back east during the fall, you would see places that have different color leaves for their trees. And you might see some red, you might see some orange and some yellow, but we don't really have this here as much in Southern California. But think about what happens to temperature and to light as we start to get towards winter, and think about why it might be that plants change color in the fall. So do you think that it's red, make a new pigment that absorbs green, yellow, stop making pigments which absorb red and blue, or green, make a new pigment that absorbs or that reflects red and yellow? And so go ahead and take a minute and pause the video, and when you're ready, go ahead and push play again. Okay, so if you said yellow, that's correct. So plants stop making pigments which absorb red and blue. And so let's talk about why that is. And so if you think about it, if a plant is going into fall and into winter in regions that can get very cold, in those places, the plants may not have access to much sunlight during the winter. And so if you think about it, from a plant standpoint, if they're going to invest energy to make chlorophyll and to make all the things that are necessary to do photosynthesis, they're going to waste that energy if there's no sunlight available. And so instead, plants kind of go into a dormant stage. And if you think about it, these leaves will eventually die and fall off the plant. And that's because that's the plant's way of conserving energy. So what ends up happening is that in the fall, as they prepare for winter, they stop making chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. But the carotenoids, those accessory pigments, hang around a little bit longer. And so if you think about it, if you looked back at your spectrum, remember that chlorophyll A and B absorbs the violet, indigo, blue, orange, red, but not the yellow and the green. But the carotenoids would still absorb the indigo, violet, purple, and some of the green. And because the carotenoids hang around for longer, the colors that end up being reflected are the red, the orange, and the yellow. And so this is why plants appear those red, orange, yellow colors during the fall, because they stop making the chlorophyll A and B first, which absorb the red and the blue. If a plant simply made a pigment that absorbs green, that would not make the leaves necessarily appear yellow, orange, or red, because the plant would also still be absorbing those wavelengths of light. If the answer was make a new pigment that reflects red and yellow, again, that doesn't solve the problem of the fact that chlorophyll would still make those pigments that absorb those lights. And so the answer then has to be yellow. They stop making chlorophyll A and B, and as a result, the plants appear red, orange, and yellow. So there are several different types of accessory pigments, and they have the job of absorbing and passing energy to chlorophyll. And this is used to exploit the range of sunlight reaching the earth, because if chlorophyll A and B only absorb certain wavelengths of light, that's a lot of energy wasted, a lot of wavelengths of light that would not be absorbed by the plant. And so instead, the plant has different accessory pigments to absorb different wavelengths of light. And so the carotenoids have a protective function, so to protect the plant from too much UV exposure, as well as herbicides, so chemicals that would inhibit plant growth. The way that some of those work is that they actually inhibit carotenoid synthesis, and so the plants die as a result. And again, this is also why fall foliage is orange or red, because those pigments will absorb the purple, the blue, and some of the green, but not the red, orange, or yellow. And so photosynthesis can be broken down into two main stages. And the first stage is going to be the light reaction. And they're named the light reaction because this is the phase that requires sunlight. And in this phase, light energy is going to be captured by the chloroplast, and water is going to split. And when water splits, it's going to donate its electrons to an electron transport chain. And as a result, that electron transport chain, just like the electron transport chain in cellular respiration, is going to be used to produce ATP. And that ATP can then be later used to build a sugar. Because remember, if you're going to build something up, you have to invest energy. In addition, the electrons that are passed from an electron transport chain are eventually going to be put onto an electron carrier. And in photosynthesis, the electron carrier is going to be referred to as NADPH. And again, this is like our electron taxi cab. It's going to pick up its electrons, and it's going to take them to the next phase, which will end up being the Calvin cycle. And so notice that for the light reactions, the products that are formed are the oxygen. And notice that the oxygen comes from the water splitting. The oxygen does not come from the carbon dioxide. It comes from the splitting of the water. And that oxygen is not going to be used in the Calvin cycle. However, the ATP and the NADPH that was formed in the light reactions, both of those will be used in the next phase of photosynthesis. Now, in the light reactions, the outcome is going to be temporary energy. Because remember that the cell's not going to store ATP long term. It's too high energy. The whole point of making the ATP, though, is to provide the energy to build the sugar. And the sugar is actually going to get built during the Calvin cycle. And so the Calvin cycle is also referred to as carbon fixation, meaning we're going to fix carbons or link carbons together to build a sugar. You'll also hear the Calvin cycle called the dark reactions or the light independent reactions. And again, it doesn't mean they have to happen in the dark. It just means that sunlight is not required. The Calvin cycle, though, again, is dependent on some of the products from the light reactions, namely the ATP and the NADPH. And it's going to use those electrons from NADPH and the energy to reduce the carbon dioxide. Remember, a reduction is a gain of electrons. So the carbon dioxide is going to gain electrons, and it's going to form sugar. And so the outcome now will be permanent energy, meaning that the cell or the organism will be able to store that energy. And remember that for plants, think for a minute, how do plants store their sugar? And if you remember back to our lecture on macromolecules, you'll remember that plants store their sugar as starch. So again, photosynthesis has two processes. The light reactions, and the light reactions take place in the thylakoid membranes. And again, water is going to split and donate electrons to an electron transport chain. That's going to produce oxygen. those electrons in the electron transport chain get put onto an electron carrier, namely NADP+. It's going to form NADPH. Remember that you always follow the hydrogens. Wherever the hydrogens go, that's where the electrons are going. So NADPH is going to have gained electrons. Additionally, we're going to use the energy from sunlight to create some ATP. And that's because the light is going to give energy to that electron transport chain, which, just like in cellular respiration, can be used to make ATP. And then the ATP and the NADPH are going to go into the Calvin cycle. And this can take place in the stroma. So again, the space inside the inner membrane, but outside the thylakoid membrane. And in the Calvin cycle, that's going to be carbon fixation. So CO2, carbon dioxide is going to come in. And during the Calvin cycle, they're going to fix that carbon dioxide into a sugar using the electrons from NADPH and also the energy from ATP. And so when we look at our redox equation for photosynthesis, remember, follow the hydrogens. So our reactants for photosynthesis, which are the things we have to put in, carbon dioxide and water. And so if we look at carbon dioxide and we look at water, we know that water has to be the source of the electrons because it has the hydrogens. And so if the water molecules are going to lose electrons, right? So if they're going to donate electrons, then we would say that water becomes oxidized. So remember back to our oil rig, oxidation is a loss, right? So water loses electrons, which means that carbon dioxide becomes reduced. It gains electrons, and it's going to give rise to the sugar. And so again, follow the hydrogens. Water is oxidized, it loses its electrons. Carbon dioxide is reduced because it gains electrons. And this process, again, requires light. Sunlight is going to be the energy that's going to be used to build a sugar. Because remember, reactions that are endergonic, right, building something up, requires the input of energy. And so the sun is going to provide that energy in photosynthesis. So, question for you. Stomata are the blank on leaves that not only let water vapor out, but let blank in. And so go ahead and pause this, and when you're ready, turn it back on and listen to the answer. Okay, so if you said purple, you are correct. The stomata are the pores on the leaves, remember on the underside of the leaves, that not only let water vapor out, and remember that water vapor leaving is important because that cohesion of water molecules helps pull the water up to the leaves. Okay, so that's an important part. But they let carbon dioxide in because the plant needs that carbon dioxide to be able to build its sugar. Now, think for a minute, what else is going to leave out of the stomata? So we said water vapor goes out. What else would leave the stomata? And the answer is that the oxygen also leaves out of the stomata. And so again, that's how plants help contribute oxygen to the atmosphere. And so we're going to go ahead and talk now about the steps in photosynthesis. And in order to understand light energy, we have to understand how that works. And so a photon is a fixed quantity of light energy. And pigment molecules absorb light. And so what ends up happening is that to that chlorophyll molecule, water gets split and it donates electrons to chlorophyll. Now, when light, which has photons, when light hits those electrons, it excites the electron and it takes it to a higher energy state. Now, that state is not going to be sustained forever. The electron is then going to fall down to its ground state and return back to normal. When it falls back down to its ground state, it gives off a little bit of heat and also some fluorescence. And so if you've ever, used glow sticks before, the way that glow sticks work is that when you actually snap those glow sticks, you mix two chemicals, and those two chemicals are used to excite electrons. And then as the electrons go back down to their ground state, they give off fluorescence. And you probably know, if you've ever used a glow stick before, does that fluorescence last forever? And the answer is no, right? Eventually, those glow sticks are going to stop glowing, and that's because those electrons have now reached their ground state and no longer give off their fluorescence. So light is absorbed by chlorophyll molecules that are embedded in the thylakoid membranes. And so notice, if we look at this, so here we have this porphyrin ring, and it has this hydrocarbon tail. And so this particular arrangement allows it to fit and span across the membrane because it's hydrocarbons, which allows it to interact with the hydrophobic interior of this membrane. And so these pigment molecules embedded in this thylakoid membrane are used to absorb wavelengths of light. And so the way that this works in the light reactions is that embedded in the thylakoid membranes are these complexes known as photosystems. And these are an organized complex of molecules within the thylakoid membrane that in photosynthesis collects solar energy and transforms it into chemical energy. And these are composed partly of antenna molecules, like chlorophyll and some accessory molecules that are there to help absorb and transmit solar energy. And so if you look here at this photosystem, put the laser pointer, so here's our photosystem, and notice that here on the side are varying pigment molecules. And remember that these pigments absorb light. And so these pigments are going to absorb that light energy, and they're going to pass that energy on. And that energy is eventually going to end up in this reaction center. And in the reaction center is a special pair of chlorophyll A molecules. And when water splits and it donates electrons to this chlorophyll A, and the light hits those electrons, that photon energy, remember that light is going to excite those electrons. It's going to bring them to a higher energy state. And then those electrons are going to get passed to electron carriers. And so this is going to have a primary electron acceptor, which will then be used to pass those electrons on. So what happens in photosynthesis? And so remember that for cellular respiration and for photosynthesis, what I want you to focus on, what goes in, what comes out, where does it take place? And so the first step is going to be the light reactions, and this occurs in the thylakoid membrane. And so what you're looking at here is our thylakoid membrane. Here's our thylakoid space, so the space inside the thylakoid membrane. Out here is our stroma. And so what you'll notice is embedded in the thylakoid membrane are these two photosystems. And each of these photosystems contains pigments, which are used to absorb wavelengths of light. There's an electron transport chain, and electron transport chains are going to be used to move the electrons down the chain. Notice another important thing that you can see in the membrane here, and this is ATP synthase. So just like in cellular respiration, in photosynthesis, the chloroplast also has ATP synthase, which remember is used to make ATP. And so let's talk about how all this works. And so what you're going to see is that, again, remember that water becomes oxidized. It's what's going to donate electrons to the electron transport chain. And so water's going to split, and it's going to donate those electrons to the electron transport chain. And as a result, oxygen is going to form. So one of the products of the light reactions is going to be oxygen. And again, this is the oxygen that we breathe. Those electrons that get put into the photosystem, remember that the pigment molecules are going to absorb the light, and when they do, they're going to excite those electrons, making them higher energy. And as the electrons go down the chain, they're going to give off a little bit of energy. And that energy is going to be used to pump hydrogens against the gradient. just like in cellular respiration. This electron transport chain, the electron energy, is going to pump hydrogens from their low concentration, in this case in the stroma, to the high concentration inside the thylakoid space. And so we're going to pump hydrogens against the gradient. The electrons come to another photosystem. Pigment molecules in this photosystem excite those electrons again, making them higher energy. The electrons move down the chain, and eventually they're going to get put onto an electron carrier. And in this case, our electron carrier is not NAD+, it's NADP+. And the way I remember this is like the P, like photosynthesis. So the electron carrier in photosynthesis is NADP+. And so it's going to gain electrons, right? And if it gains electrons, it becomes reduced, and we get NADPH. And this is going to be our electron carrier. This NADPH is going to carry those electrons to the Calvin cycle. Now, how does this make ATP? Well, again, when those electrons go down the chain and they give off energy, we're going to pump hydrogens against the gradient, which means we're going to build up an even higher hydrogen ion concentration inside the thylakoid space. And as those hydrogens go back down the gradient, again, it's like water through a turbine. When those hydrogens go down the gradient, which is a favorable reaction, it causes those turbines to spin in ATP synthase, which generates ATP. And so this ATP now can go to the Calvin cycle and be used to build our sugar. And so again, the things that you have to put in for the light reactions, we need water, because water is going to be our source of electrons. Light, because light is going to provide energy to those electrons, which allows them to pump hydrogens against the gradient. And remember that hydrogen ion gradient then is used to produce ATP. And so the things we get out, oxygen from the splitting of the water, NADPH, which is our electron carrier, and ATP. And so this is just showing you that both the chloroplasts and the mitochondria both generate ATP using chemiosmosis, so using the energy in the hydrogen ion gradients to drive cellular work. Now, mitochondria are going to transfer chemical energy from the food that you eat to chemical energy in the form of ATP. Chloroplasts, however, are going to transform light energy into the chemical energy of ATP. But again, the process through which they do this is very, very similar. They both use an electron transport chain, and that electron transport chain is used to pump hydrogens against the gradient. As the hydrogens flow down the gradient, that is going to be a favorable reaction, which causes that turbine to spin in ATP synthase, which generates ATP or energy for the cell. And so this other diagram here is just showing you where these gradients occur. In the mitochondria, it's the intermembrane space that has a high hydrogen ions, and the matrix has a low hydrogen ion concentration. In the chloroplast, the high concentration is inside the thylakoid space and lower in the stroma. But again, the process is very, very similar. So how do electrons get put onto NADP+? And the answer is that there's an enzyme that's used to transfer the electrons from the electron transport chain and put the electrons onto NADP+, forming NADPH. And this enzyme is called NADPH reductase. And notice ACE tells you enzyme, reductase because NADP+ becomes reduced. It gained electrons. And then this carrier, this NADPH, is going to transfer electrons from the light reactions to the dark reactions, which are also known as the Calvin cycle. And so the next phase, we're going to talk about the Calvin cycle. And so for this one, I'm not going to concern you with the numbers, like that you have to put in 9 ATP and 6 NADPH. Don't worry about that for this purpose. What I do want you to know again is what goes in, what comes out, where does it happen? And so the Calvin cycle takes place inside the stroma, which remember is the space inside the inner membrane, but outside of the thylakoid membrane. And so what ends up happening is, just like the Krebs cycle is a cycle, Calvin cycle is also a cycle, meaning it's a circular metabolic pathway. And so what happens in the Calvin cycle is what's called carbon fixation. CO2 is going to come in one at a time, and this CO2 gets fixed onto a small sugar already present in the Calvin cycle. And as the carbon dioxide gets put on, what we're doing eventually is trying to build up our sugar. And in the process, remember that if we're going to build something, we have to invest energy. And so that energy comes from the ATP that was produced in the light reactions. Also, if we're going to form bonds, we need to put in electrons. And so we need to put in NADPH. So NADPH is going to supply electrons to the carbon dioxide, meaning that the carbon dioxide becomes reduced as it gained electrons, and it's going to form our sugar, which is going to be G3P. So G3P is our original 3-carbon sugar that's produced as a byproduct of the Calvin cycle. And then that G3P can be used to produce other sugars for the cell as well. Notice the other outputs that you would get would be ADP. So as ATP powers the production of the sugar, ATP is going to be hydrolyzed and it's going to form ADP. NADP plus will be produced as a result of NADPH donating electrons to the carbon dioxide. And so you're going to regenerate that NADP plus, which can go back to the light reactions, pick up the electrons, and then bring them back to this cycle. Now, that G3P that gets produced during the Calvin cycle can be used for several things. About 50% of the organic material that the plant makes is going to be used as fuel to power cellular respiration in the plant. So a lot of students get confused thinking that the plant makes the sugar and they also make this ATP, and that's enough energy. But in fact, it's not. The plant also has mitochondria, and they're going to use some of the sugar that they make to power cellular respiration. And cellular respiration then is going to provide ATP for the cells. And so about 50% of the organic material is actually used to power cellular respiration. The other things that the sugar gets used for is starch. Remember that starch is a polysaccharide. It's the form of sugar that plants store. So some of that gets converted into starch where the plant can store it. Some of it gets converted into the other building blocks for macromolecules that plants need, like amino acids or fatty acids. Some of that G3P gets converted into sucrose. Sucrose is a disaccharide. That's the form of sugar that can be transported through the plant. So through the vascular system, sucrose gets passed from one part of the plant to another. And so that G3P can be used to produce various types of molecules for the plant cell. Because again, you have to remember that plants make their own food, right? They don't get those other things that they need. They have to produce it. And they do so through the G3P that they produce. So, questions for you. 2 important products of the light reactions that are used in the dark reactions of photosynthesis are, so go ahead and you're going to take a minute and pause this, and when you're ready, go ahead and push play to listen to the answer. Okay, if you said green, you're correct. So the 2 reactions, or the 2 reactants that are used from the light reactions into the dark reactions are going to be ATP, because remember that ATP is the energy needed to build our sugar, as well as NADPH. NADPH, remember, is our electron carrier. It's going to take the electrons that originally came from water and it's going to transfer those electrons onto the carbon dioxide to form the sugar. It's not going to be oxygen. Even though oxygen is produced in the light reactions, it's not used in the dark reactions. And so I have a video that I'm going to show you to kind of summarize photosynthesis.
Plants provide us with food to eat and oxygen to breathe. They perform this amazing feat by the process of photosynthesis. Let's take a closer look. Photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide, which diffuses into the leaf through small pores and then enters the cells. Inside the cell, carbon dioxide diffuses into the chloroplasts, where photosynthesis takes place. Chloroplasts use energy from light to transform carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen. Zooming into a chloroplast, we see these flattened membranous sacs called thylakoids. Here, light energy is converted to chemical energy in the first phase of photosynthesis, the light reactions. The two green structures you see here are photosystems, large complexes of proteins and chlorophyll that capture light energy. An electron transport chain connects the two photosystems. Notice the small mobile electron carriers that shuttle electrons from one large complex to another. Now let's take a closer look at the steps of the light reactions. The photosystem on the left absorbs light energy, exciting electrons that enter the electron transport chain. Electrons are replaced with electrons stripped from water, creating oxygen as a byproduct. The energized electrons flow down the electron transport chain, releasing energy that is used to pump hydrogen ions, the blue balls, into the thylakoid. In the photosystem on the right, light energy excites electrons, and this time the electrons are captured by an electron carrier molecule, NADPH. The high concentration of hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid powers ATP synthase, producing ATPs. The light reactions in the thylakoid have produced two energy products, ATP and NADPH, that will now power the production of sugar in the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle takes place outside the thylakoids in the stroma, the thick fluid of the chloroplast. At the beginning of the cycle, carbon dioxide molecules combine with molecules called RUBP. The resulting molecules go through a series of reactions powered by ATP and NADPH from the light reactions. Sugar molecules known as G3Ps are produced. Most of the G3Ps are rearranged back into RUBPs that will begin the Calvin cycle again. But the important product of photosynthesis is the remaining G3P sugar. Some G3Ps are used to build glucose, which can combine into starch or cellulose. Still other G3Ps form sucrose. And some of the sugar is broken down by cellular respiration using oxygen in the plant's own mitochondria, generating ATPs that can power other work of the plant. Excess oxygen diffuses out of the leaf through the pores, while more carbon dioxide enters. With three simple ingredients, carbon dioxide, water, and light, plants produce sugar and oxygen by photosynthesis, powering plant metabolism and ultimately providing your fuel as well.
And so I put this slide here. I'm not going to ask you the specifics about this, but I do want you to realize that plants have variations in photosynthesis that help them adapt to different environments. And so one of the ways in which plants can adapt to their environment is to do something called the C4 pathway. And in a C4 photosynthesis pathway, these plants are going to close their stomata to save water during hot and dry weather. Yet they can still carry out photosynthesis. And that's because they have this spatial separation of steps. They actually convert carbon dioxide into an organic acid, which is stored and then can be used for the Calvin cycle later. Another adaptation or another variation of photosynthesis is what's called the CAM pathway. And this is for plants that are adapted to very dry climates. And again, you wouldn't want the stomata, if you're in a very dry climate, you're not going to want the stomata to be open all day where they can lose a lot of water. And so in this case, the plants actually close their stomata during the day, and they only open them at night. And so the plant has to be able to take in the carbon dioxide at night and then save it until the day when the ATP and the NADPH from the light reactions becomes available. And so this is just another variation for photosynthesis. And so again, this just kind of reiterates that plants and animals are mutually dependent, right? That animals do cellular respiration, and they take organic molecules like glucose and oxygen, and they break down the energy that's in the glucose into carbon dioxide and water, and they produce ATP, which powers cellular work. Plants then do photosynthesis. They take carbon dioxide and water, and they fix carbon dioxide using light energy into sugar, and the water splits and gives rise to the oxygen. And then again, in the mitochondria, the process continues.
When the first mission to Mars is launched, people will live in space for extended lengths of time. They will need to produce food, water, and oxygen to survive. NASA scientists are experimenting on plants to develop onboard greenhouses that do just that. In one experiment, volunteer Nigel Packham spent 2 weeks in a pair of airtight containers. Instead of oxygen canisters, wheat plants provided all the air he needed to breathe. Plants absorbed the carbon dioxide Nigel breathed out and used it to produce the oxygen they both needed to survive. This exchange worked even when he exercised. As Nigel used up more oxygen and produced more carbon dioxide, the plants absorbed more carbon dioxide and produced more oxygen.
The plants have performed wonderfully. They react very quickly to me being here and to changes in my metabolic output. For example, if I sit on the bicycle and start exercising for 30 minutes, and I tend to put out a lot more carbon dioxide, the plants react very, very rapidly to that. So it's almost as if they know I'm here.
After 2 weeks, the experiment ended and Nigel emerged in good health. The results show that people can depend on plants for oxygen in an artificial environment. Now scientists want to know how long that balance can last.
Hi, Greg.
In another experiment, a NASA team manipulates the growing conditions of vegetable-yielding plants. Using artificial nutrients in high-intensity lamps, David Bubenheim grows plants 10 to 20 times more densely than they occur in nature. This is helpful for producing food in very limited spaces. Based on this prototype, they determined the size of a greenhouse needed to support a crew headed for Mars.
This chamber is about 200 square feet, and for a crew of 4 people, it would be able to supply and recycle all of the air and water, but it wouldn't supply 100% of the food in that case. To do that, you would need an area about 4 times this large, or a chamber about this size per person.
Since areas that large aren't practical in space, Bubenheim hopes that changing the color of light can solve the problem. Plants used in these experiments gather the energy they need from fluorescent light rather than sunlight. Changing the color of this light will change the way the plants grow.
If you look at these wheat plants that are growing under white light, like plants would outside, where all colors of the spectrum are represented, you can see that there are a number of smaller side shoots that are grown.
Side shoots are waste that has to be recycled. But growing wheat under blue lights eliminates these shoots, leaving the important center shoot unharmed.
red light works in much the same way. Scientists now want to know if the color of light has the same effect on plants other than wheat. If so, they'll be one step closer to an efficient plant-based system that can support life in space.
And so again, when we think of plants and animals, plants we typically say are autotrophs. Animals are going to be heterotrophs. But there are in fact some animals that can also be photoautotrophs. And an example of this was that scientists actually discovered a solar-powered sea slug. And this particular sea slug, which lives in salt marshes, has chloroplasts that are in the lining of a gut. And it acquired this by eating algae. And at some point, a gene required for photosynthesis moved from the algae into the genome of the sea slug. Now, it was thought originally that in fact the sea slug was always able to do photosynthesis, meaning that they had actually acquired it in their own genome and was able to pass it on. But in fact, they found that it's not incorporated into their genome and that they get it during their lifespan, and this allows them to do photosynthesis. And so this concludes your lecture on photosynthesis.